Elias Whitaker's gallery was the kind of place that people spoke about in hushed, reverent tones. Nestled in a forgotten corner of the city, its unassuming exterior betrayed nothing of the eerie marvels inside. Those who visited left feeling profoundly unsettled, though they couldn't quite articulate why. His sculptures, monuments to human emotion, were lauded as masterpieces. Each seemed imbued with life, frozen at the precise moment of an unnamed climax. Elias had opened the gallery only 6 months prior, but its notoriety had spread like wildfire. Art critics hailed him as a genius, and collectors scrambled to own one of his works. Yet, for all the praise, no one truly knew Elias. He rarely attended his own exhibitions, preferring to observe from the shadows, his pale green eyes tracking each guest's reaction to his latest piece. That Friday night, the gallery hummed with excitement. The unveiling of Elias's newest sculpture, Despair Reclaimed, had drawn an eclectic crowd of art lovers, journalists, and collectors. The anticipation was palpable, a crackling tension that seemed to hang in the air as everyone gathered around the draped pedestal in the center of the room. When Elias emerged, his presence commanded immediate attention. He was gaunt and wiry, his black suit fitting his frame with the precision of a shroud. His voice was soft but clear as he addressed the crowd, his words laced with a subtle gravity that made every syllable feel significant. "I thank you all for being here tonight," he said. "This piece represents a deep exploration of anguish and redemption. I present to you Despair Reclaimed." He pulled the velvet cloth away, revealing a marble figure of a young woman. Her face was contorted in despair, her arms outstretched as though reaching for salvation. The room fell silent, save for the occasional gasp. The detail was staggering, her skin appeared soft and supple, her eyes brimming with emotion so vivid that it seemed they might shed tears at any moment. "It's incredible," someone whispered. "It's like she's alive," another murmured. Elias stood back, allowing the admiration to wash over him. His lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile, but his eyes remained fixed on the sculpture, almost as if he were seeing something the others could not. Among the guests was Clara Evans, a journalist with a reputation for uncovering the secrets artists would rather keep buried. She was skeptical of Elias's meteoric rise, her instincts telling her there was more to his story than sheer talent. Clara watched as Elias slipped through a side door after the unveiling, his silhouette disappearing into the shadows. Her curiosity flared. She lingered until the last of the guests departed and the lights dimmed. When the gallery fell silent, she followed the path Elias had taken, slipping through the same door. The hallway beyond was stark and dimly lit, leading to a heavy door at the end. As Clara crept closer, she could hear faint movements from within. Her pulse quickened. She pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. The room was a workshop, cluttered with chisels, carving tools, and blocks of what appeared to be marble. In the center stood Elias, his back to her as he bent over a table. Her eyes widened as she took in what lay before him. It was a woman. Her body was rigid, her skin unnaturally pale. At first, Clara thought she was looking at another sculpture, but the details were wrong. The woman's hair lay limp against her neck, her eyelashes casting delicate shadows across her face. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth: this wasn't marble. The woman's body was coated in a thin, stone-like substance, her expression frozen in terror. Elias was applying a viscous gray material to her skin, the substance hardening instantly upon contact. His movements were meticulous, almost reverent, as though he were preserving something sacred. Clara fought the urge to scream. Her hands trembled as she watched him work, every fiber of her being screaming at her to run. But she couldn't tear her eyes away. Elias paused, his hand hovering over the woman's face. "You're perfect now," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Clara's stomach churned. She backed away from the door, her mind racing with questions. What was this material? How many of his sculptures were like this? How many people had he turned to stone? She fled the gallery, her breath ragged as she stumbled into the cool night air. She didn't stop running until she was several blocks away, her thoughts a chaotic whirl. She had uncovered the truth behind Elias's work, but now she had to decide what to do with it. Elias's sculptures weren't carved. They were real people, preserved in their final moments. And somehow, he had perfected the art of hiding it in plain sight. Clara sat in her apartment, the dull hum of the city muffled by her closed windows. Her hands trembled as she sipped her third cup of coffee, replaying the events of the previous night over and over. The lifelike sculptures. The woman on the table. Elias's cold, meticulous movements as he turned her into art. She couldn't bring herself to write about it, not yet. What she'd seen defied belief, and her editor wouldn't publish such an outrageous claim without proof. Clara needed evidence, but returning to the gallery felt like stepping into the lion's den. She couldn't shake the memory of Elias's face, calm, composed, and utterly unbothered by the horrors he was committing. She decided to start small. Before confronting Elias directly, Clara would dig into his past. She fired up her laptop and began searching for any records she could find, old interviews, public records, anything to give her a clearer picture of the men behind the marble. Elias Whitaker's early career was almost a blank slate. His official biography claimed he was self-taught, having worked with various mediums before finding his passion in sculpture. There were no details about his life before his first exhibition 6 months ago, no indication of where he had studied or lived. It was as though he had materialized out of thin air. Clara leaned back in her chair, frustration bubbling in her chest. The trail was cold. But then she remembered something, a comment from a guest at the gallery's opening night. They had mentioned a sculpture accident at one of Elias's early private shows. With renewed focus, Clara dug deeper, combing through obscure forums and old articles until she found it, a small, poorly written piece about a tragic accident at an art exhibit 3 years earlier in a nearby city. The exhibit had featured an up-and-coming sculptor named Elias Whitaker. One of his pieces, a towering marble statue, had supposedly collapsed, injuring 2 patrons. The article raised more questions than it answered. Why had this incident been buried? And why had Elias disappeared from the art world until recently? Clara scrawled the address of the exhibit into her notebook and decided to visit the location. If there was any chance of finding someone who remembered Elias, it was worth a shot. The building was a shadow of its former self, its facade chipped and faded. A for lease sign hung crookedly in the window, swaying in the breeze. Clara pushed the door open, the creak echoing through the empty space. Inside, dust coated every surface, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. Clara wandered through the cavernous room, her footsteps stirring up small clouds of dirt. It was hard to imagine this place as the site of an art exhibit, let alone a tragedy. As she turned a corner, Clara nearly tripped over something, a small, weathered plaque lying face down on the floor. She flipped it over and felt her stomach twist. The Weight of Sorrow, by Elias Whitaker, it read. The title sent a chill down her spine. She remembered it from the gallery, displayed alongside another of his sculptures. The same name, the same eerie mastery of human emotion. Clara knelt and traced the edges of the plaque, her fingers brushing against something sticky. Blood. It was old, dried into the grooves of the wood, but unmistakable. Clara stood quickly, her pulse hammering in her ears. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't just an accident. She took out her phone and began snapping pictures, documenting everything, the plaque, the faint impressions of footprints in the dust, even the unsettling scratches along the walls. The more she looked, the more convinced she became that this space had been abandoned in a hurry. Later that evening, Clara met with an old contact, Detective Sam Grayson. She showed him the photos and explained what she'd seen in Elias's workshop. She omitted certain details, knowing they sounded far-fetched, but Grayson didn't look surprised. You're not the first person to raise concerns about Whitaker, he said, leaning back in his chair. We had a few reports, people who went missing after attending his gallery openings. No solid leads, though. Why hasn't he been investigated? Clara asked, incredulous. Grayson shrugged. He's careful. Smart. We haven't been able to tie him to anything concrete. Well, now you have these, Clara said, gesturing to the photos. Grayson studied them, his expression darkening. It's not enough. A plaque and some old blood don't prove he's involved in anything criminal. We need something stronger. Clara clenched her fists. She'd expected as much, but it didn't make the reality any easier to swallow. What about the people who went missing? Their families. We've tried, Grayson said. But without a body or a connection to Elias, our hands are tied. Clara's mind raced. She couldn't let this go. The world needed to know what Elias was doing, and if the police couldn't stop him, maybe she could. Be careful, Grayson warned as she left. People who poke around Whitaker's business don't tend to stick around for long. Back in her apartment, Clara laid out her plan. She would go back to the gallery, not during one of its lavish events, but after hours, when Elias was alone. She'd find something the police couldn't ignore, something that would expose him once and for all. But as she prepared, a nagging sense of dread crept over her. Clara felt as though she were being watched. The air in her apartment felt heavy, and her chest tightened with every passing minute. She shook it off, forcing herself to focus. If Elias thought he could hide his crimes forever, he was wrong. Clara Evans wouldn't let him. In the quiet of the gallery's shadows, Elias sat alone in his workshop. His newest creation, a woman encased in gleaming stone, rested on the table before him. His hands moved methodically, brushing away imperfections as he hummed softly to himself. He paused, his head tilting slightly, as though he could feel Clara's resolve miles away. A faint smile curled his lips. "Curiosity is such a dangerous thing," he murmured to the silent room. Clara spent the next 2 days preparing for her return to Elias Whitaker's gallery. She packed a small bag with essentials, her camera, a flashlight, gloves, and a small pocket knife, more for comfort than any real sense of defense. The memory of the woman's stony form haunted her every thought, her frozen expression seared into Clara's mind like a photograph she couldn't discard. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara's resolve had hardened. She wasn't just a journalist chasing a story anymore, she was someone who had seen the truth, and it was her responsibility to make sure it didn't stay hidden. At midnight, Clara parked a block away from the gallery and approached on foot. The street was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt deliberate. The gallery loomed ahead, its large windows dark and uninviting. The back entrance was unlocked, just as she had hoped. Elias, arrogant in his isolation, probably assumed no one would dare intrude. Clara slipped inside, the chill of the gallery enveloping her like a shroud. She navigated the familiar space, her flashlight slicing through the darkness. The sculptures stood in their usual places, their lifelike forms casting unnervingly realistic shadows across the walls. Clara avoided looking too closely at them. Now that she knew their secret, the sight of their frozen faces made her stomach churn. She reached the door leading to Elias's workshop and hesitated. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to turn back, to leave this nightmare behind and never speak of it again. But she couldn't. Not when there were more people, living, breathing people, who might already be on Elias's table. Pushing the door open, Clara stepped inside. The workshop was just as she remembered, cluttered with tools, half-finished sculptures, and the faint, sickly sweet smell of chemicals. But something was different this time. In the center of the room stood a new figure, draped in a white sheet. Clara's breath hitched as she approached. Her hands trembled as she lifted the edge of the sheet, revealing the unmistakable contours of a human form beneath. The sheet slid to the floor, and Clara recoiled. The figure was a young man, his face twisted in an expression of panic. His body was entirely encased in the same stone-like substance, and his arms were frozen mid-reach, as though he had tried to claw his way free. Clara snapped photos, each click of the camera echoing in the stillness. Her instincts told her to leave, to flee while she still could. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this man wasn't the only victim here. A noise behind her made her jump, a faint scraping sound, like metal against stone. She whirled around, her flashlight beam darting across the room. It landed on a far corner, where another covered figure stood. Clara's chest tightened. She stepped closer, her every movement slow and deliberate. As she reached the figure, the flashlight's beam illuminated something on the ground, a trail of dark, congealed liquid leading to the base of the sculpture. Her breath caught. She pulled back the sheet, revealing a woman mid-transformation. Half of her body was still human, her skin pale and clammy. The other half was encased in stone, the gray substance spreading like veins up her neck. Her eyes were open, wide with terror, but lifeless. Clara stumbled back, her legs weak beneath her. The reality of Elias's work hit her like a tidal wave. These people weren't just victims, they were being preserved in the most horrific way imaginable, their final moments captured for eternity. A soft click echoed behind her. Clara froze, turning her head slowly. Elias stood in the doorway, his green eyes glinting in the dim light. "You should have stayed away," he said, his voice calm, almost regretful. Clara gripped her flashlight tightly, her mind racing. She tried to keep her voice steady. "You're a monster. These are people, Elias. How could you do this? Elias stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. You see them as victims, he said, his tone measured. I see them as art. Immortalized in their purest form. The human experience is fleeting, Miss Evans. I've found a way to preserve it forever. That's not preservation, Clara snapped. It's murder. Elias tilted his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. Murder is such a crude term. I'm simply ensuring they'll never be forgotten. Clara took a step back, her eyes darting to the door. Elias noticed and let out a low chuckle. There's no point in running, he said. You came here to uncover the truth, didn't you? Now you've seen it. Clara's pulse thundered in her ears. She could see the mallet in Elias's hand, the flecks of stone dust clinging to his dark coat. I won't let you get away with this, she said, her voice trembling. Elias raised an eyebrow. And how do you plan to stop me? With a surge of adrenaline, Clara hurled her flashlight at him and bolted for the door. The impact made Elias stumble, but he recovered quickly, his footsteps heavy behind her. She raced through the gallery, her heart pounding as she weaved between sculptures. The oppressive silence of the space seemed to press down on her, amplifying the sound of Elias's pursuit. Clara reached the back door and shoved it open, the cool night air hitting her like a lifeline. She didn't stop running until she was blocks away, her lungs burning and her vision blurred with tears. When she finally stopped, she collapsed onto a park bench, her entire body trembling. She had escaped, but the weight of what she had witnessed remained. Elias Whitaker was more than just a murderer. He was an artist who had found a way to turn his victims into monuments to his twisted vision. And Clara knew he wouldn't stop until someone forced him to. As she sat in the darkness, she made a silent vow. She would expose Elias, no matter the cost. Clara couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, the lifeless gaze of Elias's victim stared back at her, their frozen expressions etched into her mind. The images from his workshop haunted her, the young man's outstretched hands, the woman's half-transformed body, the sickening trail of blood that led nowhere. Morning came too quickly, bathing her small apartment in pale light. She sat by her laptop, staring at the photos she'd taken. They were damning, yet horrifyingly surreal. Would anyone believe these weren't elaborate sculptures? Could she convince the world that Elias Whitaker was a murderer and not a misunderstood artist? She considered calling the police, but after her conversation with Detective Grayson, she knew she needed more than photos. She needed something undeniable, something even Elias couldn't explain away. The idea struck her like a lightning bolt, the substance. The gray, stone-like material that Elias used to encase his victims. If she could retrieve a sample, it might provide forensic evidence tying him to the disappearances. Her chest tightened at the thought of returning to the gallery, but she forced herself to push the fear aside. Elias wouldn't stop until someone exposed him, and Clara knew she was the only person willing to take that risk. As night fell, Clara armed herself with everything she could think of: gloves, a utility knife, a small vial for the sample, and her phone to document everything. This time, she parked even farther away and approached the gallery on foot, every step heavy with dread. The back entrance was still unlocked. Clara slipped inside, her heart pounding as she navigated the dark, silent gallery. The sculptures loomed around her, their lifelike features seeming to track her movement. She avoided looking at their faces, focusing instead on her goal. The workshop door creaked softly as she pushed it open. The room was empty, and for a brief moment, Clara felt a flicker of relief. She stepped inside, her flashlight sweeping over the chaotic space. She spotted the table where the young man's body had been the night before. The figure was gone, replaced by a fresh block of marble that stood ominously in its place. Clara's stomach churned. He was already on display somewhere, rebranded as another one of Elias's masterpieces. Clara approached a workbench covered in jars and tools. One jar caught her attention. It was filled with the gray substance Elias had been applying to the woman. Her fingers trembled as she unscrewed the lid and scooped some into her vial. The material was thick and viscous, clinging to her glove like molasses. She sealed the vial and tucked it into her bag, exhaling shakily. Her job was nearly done. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something odd, a faint metallic glint beneath the workbench. She crouched down, her flashlight revealing a trapdoor partially concealed by loose boards. Clara hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, but her curiosity overpowered her fear. If Elias had gone to the trouble of hiding something, it had to be important. She pried the boards loose and pulled open the trapdoor. A cold, musty draft rose from the darkness below. Clara aimed her flashlight into the void and saw a narrow staircase leading down. The air grew colder with every step. The staircase ended in a cavernous basement, its walls lined with shelves of jars, tools, and photographs. Clara's breath caught as she realized what she was looking at. The photographs were of people, dozens of them, each posed like Elias's sculptures. Some were laughing, others mid-conversation, their expressions unguarded and natural. Clara recognized a few faces from missing person reports she'd seen during her research. A low hum filled the space, drawing her attention to the far corner. There, glowing faintly under a heat lamp, was a massive vat of the gray substance. It pulsed and shimmered as though alive, its surface rippling unnaturally. Clara edged closer, horrified yet transfixed. Was this where Elias made the material? Or was it something else entirely? The substance seemed almost organic, as though it had a will of its own. Her phone buzzed, shattering the silence. Clara scrambled to silence it, her heart racing. She glanced at the screen. It was a text from Detective Grayson. "Any progress? Be careful." The sound must have alerted someone. From above, she heard the faint creak of floorboards. Clara froze, her pulse thundering in her ears. Footsteps descended the stairs, deliberate and heavy. She darted behind a shelf, clutching her phone tightly. Elias's voice cut through the darkness, calm and cold. "I was wondering how long it would take you to find this." Clara pressed herself against the wall, her breath shallow. "You're not the first to uncover my work," Elias continued, his footsteps drawing closer. "But you might be the most persistent." Clara's mind raced. She needed a way out, but the stairs were the only exit. "I understand your fascination," Elias said, his tone almost conversational. "You're a seeker of truth. I admire that. It's a shame you won't live to share it." Clara gripped the utility knife in her pocket, her fingers trembling. If Elias found her, she'd have no choice but to fight. The footsteps stopped. Clara peeked through the gap in the shelves and saw him standing by the vat, his green eyes glinting in the faint light. "You don't understand what I've created," he said, almost mournfully. "Art that transcends time. These people, my subjects, they'll never decay, never fade. They'll exist forever, perfect and unchanging." Clara's anger flared. She stepped out from her hiding spot, her voice steady despite the fear twisting in her gut. "They're not your subjects. They're victims." Elias turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Victims," he repeated softly. "They're immortal. I've given them eternity." Clara tightened her grip on the knife. "You've stolen their lives. You're a coward hiding behind your delusions of artistry." Elias's lips curled into a faint smile. "Brave words for someone who's about to become my next masterpiece." With a sudden burst of movement, Clara lunged at him. Elias dodged, grabbing her wrist and twisting it until the knife clattered to the floor. "You should have stayed in the shadows," he said, his grip like iron. Clara struggled, her mind racing for a plan. Her eyes darted to the vat, the substance glowing ominously. Desperation overtook her. With all her strength, she kicked Elias in the chest, sending him stumbling backward, straight into the vat. The substance surged as he fell in, enveloping him instantly. Elias screamed, his voice a guttural roar as the material consumed him. His form twisted and writhed before solidifying, his body frozen in mid-contortion. Clara backed away, her chest heaving. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the substance, which seemed to pulse with a quiet, unsettling satisfaction. She didn't wait to see what happened next. Clara bolted up the stairs and out of the gallery, clutching the vial in her bag like a lifeline. The night swallowed her as she ran, but she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Clara didn't stop running until she reached the safety of her apartment. Slamming the door shut behind her, she collapsed onto the floor, her breath ragged, her body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. The images of Elias's workshop, the photographs, and the pulsing vat of gray substance played on a relentless loop in her mind. The last thing she saw before fleeing, Elias's form frozen in his own monstrous creation, was seared into her memory. She retrieved the vial from her bag, setting it carefully on the kitchen counter. The material inside shimmered faintly, its surface rippling like liquid mercury. Clara stared at it, her unease deepening. It felt wrong, alive in a way that defied explanation. This was the key. It had to be. The next morning, Clara met with Detective Grayson in a quiet diner on the edge of town. She slid the vial across the table, her voice low. "This is what he used. It's how he did it." Grayson picked up the vial, holding it up to the light. His brow furrowed as he examined the strange substance. "And you're sure this is what encased the victims?" Clara nodded. "I saw it happen, Grayson. I watched him use it. He was making another sculpture when I got there." Her voice cracked. They were still half human. Grayson's jaw tightened. He signaled to a passing waitress for the check, his demeanor tense. "I'll have this analyzed." "But we need more, Clara. Photos and testimony aren't enough to hold up in court. Without concrete proof linking him to the missing people, it's all circumstantial." "What about Elias himself?" Clara asked. She hesitated, unsure how to explain what had happened. "He's gone," she said finally. Grayson frowned. "Gone? What do you mean?" Clara shook her head, her hands trembling. "He fell into the substance. It consumed him. It turned him into one of his own creations." The detective's expression shifted to skepticism. "That's a hell of a story, Clara. And if he's dead, it's going to be even harder to prove anything." "I'm telling the truth," Clara insisted. "I don't doubt you saw something," Grayson said carefully. "But without him to answer for it, we're left with nothing but your word and a lot of unanswered questions." Clara's frustration boiled over. "Then take this," she snapped, gesturing to the vial. "Analyze it, test it, whatever you need to do. But this is real, Grayson. He killed those people, and I can't let it be for nothing." Grayson sighed, pocketing the vial. "I'll do what I can." Weeks passed, and Clara heard nothing from Grayson. The gallery remained locked, its pristine facade hiding the horrors within. No news of Elias's disappearance had surfaced, and the world seemed content to move on, oblivious to the darkness he had left behind. Clara tried to write the story, but every draft felt inadequate. How could she put into words the grotesque reality of what she had witnessed? How could she convince people that Elias Whitaker's art was born of unimaginable cruelty? She spent her nights researching, digging into missing person cases that might be linked to Elias. The list was longer than she had anticipated. Faces of smiling young men and women stared back at her from grainy photographs, their stories left unfinished. One night, as she sat hunched over her laptop, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Grayson. "Come to the station. I have answers." Clara arrived at the precinct an hour later, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. Grayson met her in his office, the vial of gray substance sitting on his desk. "We analyzed it," he said without preamble. "It's not like anything we've ever seen. Organic, but not. It reacts to blood in ways that are impossible to replicate in a lab. It's almost as if it feeds on it." Clara's stomach turned. "And the people Elias encased? What about them?" Grayson hesitated, his expression grim. "The material preserves their bodies, but their tissues are still biologically alive." Her breath caught. "Alive? Not in the way you'd think," Grayson clarified. "Their hearts don't beat, and they're not conscious. But their cells show signs of activity. It's like they're stuck in a liminal state, neither fully alive nor dead." Clara felt a wave of nausea. The victims weren't just murdered. They were imprisoned, suspended in some horrific half-existence. "We're going to open the gallery," Grayson continued. "Recover what's left of his victims and dismantle that workshop. But it's going to take time." Clara nodded, though the thought of stepping foot in the gallery again made her blood run cold. The raid on the gallery made national news. Police uncovered dozens of sculptures, each painstakingly identified as a missing person. The victims were transported to a secure lab, where scientists worked to reverse the effects of the gray substance. Elias Whitaker's name became synonymous with horror, his art condemned as a grotesque testament to his twisted genius. Clara's exposé brought her acclaim, but it felt hollow. She couldn't forget the faces of those who had been lost, their lives stolen by Elias's obsession. The gallery was demolished, the remnants of Elias's workshop buried beneath rubble. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. One night, months later, her phone buzzed. The number was unlisted. Clara hesitated before answering. "Hello." The line crackled. A familiar voice, low and calm, sent chills down her spine. "Thank you for preserving my legacy, Ms. Evans." The call ended before she could respond. Clara stared at her phone, her hands trembling. In her bag, the vial of gray substance shimmered faintly in the dark. Elias Whitaker was gone. But his work, it seemed, had only just begun.